right, everyone, if you could take your seats. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things first, and then we'll get started with the panel. One, I wanted to reiterate today what I said yesterday, and that is a number of our speakers and moderators, many of them, in fact, are authors of books on counterterrorism, and all of them should be available, at least the recent ones, in the back, thanks to the good offices of Explorer Booksellers here in Aspen, so I hope you'll avail yourselves of that. Also, we'll talk about foreign policy here in a minute, but I know that there are some copies of Foreign Policy magazine and some subscription forms, which Susan would appreciate your availing yourselves of. I also want to mention, and Walter gave a shout-out to Josh Gerstein from Politico for his terrific article today about the Admiral Blair session yesterday. There's a superb piece in today's New York Times by Eric Schmidt, from whom you'll hear later, about the lighter session yesterday, and Kimberly Dozier from AP has written a number of pieces as well, and so we hope that that will continue during the course of the forum. Joe Cirincione told me that he's tweeted about this session as well, so this may have the feel of a salon, but we're actually taking this out across the country, and it's being live-streamed as well, thanks to the Aspen Institute's ability to do that. And then finally, during the Q&A session, just to help with the microphones and with our cameras in the back, if you, when you ask a question, could please stand up, it would help to make sure that everything is duly recorded. With that, let's start this session. Both presidents, I think we mentioned this earlier during the forum, both President Bush and President Obama quite rightly said that the number one counterterrorism threat, in fact, the number one national security threat facing the country is the threat of terrorists acquiring nuclear weapons. And we know that terrorists have tried over the years to do just that. To explore this and related issues regarding nuclear security, we have a superb panel. The moderator will introduce the panelists, but let me introduce the moderator. I've known Susan Glasser for so many years, I can't quite remember how we first came to know each other, but Susan's a very distinguished journalist who began her career at Roll Call. She was there for a number of years, and then she ultimately moved on to the Washington Post, where she served as a longtime foreign correspondent there and editor. Speaking of books, she's the co-author with her husband Peter Baker at the New York Times of a superb book about Russia, Kremlin Rising, Putin's Russia, and the End of the Revolution. And she's now the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. So with that, Susan, thank you very much.
Oh, Clark, thank you so much. I think it's an incredible honor to be here, and with such an all-star group. I suppose there's some hair-raising scenarios to scare us all with early on a beautiful Friday morning. But first, I wanted to do a quick introduction of this terrific panel. And I'll just go in order, and then we'll jump right in. Right to the next to me is Robert Gallucci, who I'm sure you all know as the president of the MacArthur Foundation and the former dean of the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown. He is followed by Joe Cirincione, who is the president of the Ploughshares Fund. He is also an inveterate tweeter, as Clark mentioned, and if you're not already following him, I'm sure he's looking forward to coming out of this conference with a few dozen premium new followers. So thank you, Joe. Megan Garcia is also joining us. She's a fellow in the president's office at the Hewlett Foundation, and she manages the foundation's nuclear security initiative. And finally, we have Warren Stern with us, who is the head at the Department of Homeland Security of the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. And they're doing all sorts of actual real-world things in terms of combating the kinds of threats we'll be talking about today. So with that, and no further ado, I think Clark really set out the framework for us this morning, which is to say there's a widespread consensus across political parties, across different leaderships, that this is the top security issue that we face. But as I found in our pre-conversation with this group, there's not as much consensus on what do we do about it, what is the hierarchy of this threat, is it truly the number one security threat that the United States faces, an act of nuclear terrorism or proliferation from state actors. So I thought we'd jump right in with that. Joe has brought talking points, so perhaps he gets the first word there.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you for the Aspen Institute for bringing us all here. There are lots of security threats to the country. Admiral Fallon often said that the climate change was one of the security threats we had to face. The recent chairman of the Joint Chiefs argued that the debt crisis was a major threat to the United States. But in the traditional security field, there's a clear consensus that number one is the threat of nuclear terrorism. Here's the national security strategy of the United States on this. The American people face no greater or more urgent danger than a terrorist attack with a nuclear weapon. Now, to get a sentence like that in the national security strategy is no easy feat. You have to build the consensus for this. There has to be agreement across the security and intelligence communities, and there is, and it's been this way for years. You might say the second threat that gets mentioned most frequently is the spread of these nuclear weapons to other countries. This is what the Nuclear Posture Review, just completed by the United States last year, also said. These are the twin dangers we face. So the question is, are we putting our money where our threats are? Are we really acting on this? Do we really believe that this is true? And I would argue that we're not. And I'm picking up on what that excellent panel just preceding us had to say. We are not right-sizing our defense. We're not putting our money where our true national security threats are. Here's just one example. Our nuclear posture, our nuclear forces are still configured to fight last century's war. They're still configured as if a major threat is not nuclear terrorism, but a bolt out of the blue attack from the Soviet Union. We spend about $54 billion a year on nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons-related programs. We're planning to spend $700 billion on these programs over the next 10 years. That's as much as we spent over the last decade on the war in Iraq. Is that where we should put our money? Only a very small fraction of that, somewhere around $4 billion a year, goes directly to address the nuclear terrorist threat. We have an urgent task ahead of us to correlate our money, our resources, with our national security strategy.
Do you agree, Bob, that we're underprivileging this particular threat?
I always agree with Joe. I think I agree with the first part of the sentence, that we ought to put our resources against the threat as we assess its magnitude. But what I'm not sure of is that the character of this threat that we're talking about, whether it's the proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional states, think Iran, think the growth in North Korea of their nuclear capability, or the nuclear terrorist threat, that these are necessarily huge budget issues. I would say if you identified something you wanted to do, if Warren's going to tell us that there's something he'd really like to be able to do in the area of detection, so that if we catch a weapon coming into the United States, we'll be able to figure out where it came from and where its components were made, and we could tell the rest of the world that we will be able to find out if you were complicit in any way in the fabrication of a device or the delivery of the device in order to deter folks from doing that. I'd say let's give Warren what he needs for his budget. So I agree kind of the analytical proposition that Joe just framed, but if you got right down to it, I'm not sure that resource application here is the major problem.
So what is the major problem?
For me, when I think about I hope I'm using this phrase right, the sensitivities on this issue. This issue is, I suspect for this audience, you'd all agree that this would be a really bad thing if a nuclear weapon was detonated in an American city, or at least I hope you would. But the reason it might not capture your imagination quite like some of the other things is because you don't think it's very likely. This is not, if the threat is the product of the probability of the event and the magnitude of the consequences. No one here, I think, is going to spend a lot of time on the magnitude of the consequences. We're going to focus on the probability of the event. And that, it turns out, men and women of goodwill disagree on quite a lot. I think it's a lot more plausible than other people. And when I'm getting to answer your question, when I think about what makes it more likely, therefore a threat that we need to worry about more, I think about what influences that, and two things come in, maybe three, but one is the availability of fissile material. And so when I think about this, the one huge thing that would change the probability calculations is if a lot of countries adopted the use of plutonium in their civilian nuclear fuel cycles. China may do that soon, and that'll be a lot of plutonium moving all over that country. South Korea might want to do it. Japan was going to do it. India wants to do it. Russia does it. France does it. We have sort of decided with the blue ribbon report, I think, the Blue Commission's report, that we are going to store our spent fuel rather than crack it open, pull out the plutonium, and recycle it. So I think that's a big deal. It is, to me, not a big budget issue in defense terms, but it's an enormous change. It would mean enormous change in the possibility of this occurring. The second is managing the cases where either weapons or material might come from. And the way I would do this, I'd ask the question, if there was a nuclear terrorist attack tomorrow morning, and it wasn't in Washington, so we could have hearings, and we ended up testifying, and we were all asked, where do you think the weapon came from or the material came from? Just wag that. I'm guessing we would say either Russia, because there's so much material, or we'd say Pakistan. There's a lot less, but there are special problems. So I would say I'd focus a lot of energy right there. And then the third thing is I'd focus a lot of energy on one of the things that Warren does. I think I'd love to capture or recapture some deterrence in this area. We don't really have very much right now, and our defense is awful. If our plan is to stop the weapon from coming into the United States, that's a lousy plan. So if we as we did and still do in the nuclear area with respect to big nuclear powers, plan on deterrence, I'd like to have some deterrence in this area, but Warren's going to have to succeed first.
No, I think that's a perfect point, because what is it that we're actually doing in terms of defense?
Thank you, and I really appreciate that opportunity to be here with so many people that I've looked up to throughout my career. I mean, when you ask the budget question, fundamentally you have to look at and ask the question, what are we trying to do? And how do we structure the way we think? And what we're trying to do is to make nuclear terrorism prohibitively difficult. We want to make it so difficult that no one ever tries. And to do that, there are a couple of areas that you look at. One, Bob mentioned, which is to minimize or eliminate the use of nuclear usable materials in civil fuel cycles and in other applications. From there, you want to ensure that countries that use nuclear material have adequate materials protection systems, physical protection, and account for their systems. You want to be able to apply safeguards in countries. You want to be able to detect materials abroad. And ultimately, the last line of defense is you want to be able to detect materials and respond to those detection activities within the United States and be able to do the forensics that Bob mentioned, so you can trace back where the material came from. And the U.S. is hitting on all of those elements in various areas. My particular two areas are nuclear detection, how it is that we go about responding to intelligence to apply detection technologies, and nuclear forensics, which is helping to figure out where nuclear material that has been found, where it came from. And nuclear forensics really have a number of applications. One is to shut down the sources of this material, because most of the cases of weapons-grade material involve small quantities. And the other is, if there is ever a large amount or a weapon found, being able to figure out where it came from. So the administration is working very hard on all of those elements. In the area of detection, which DNDO has primary responsibility for, we're changing our focus quite a bit, because in the past we focused more on static detectors, on detectors at borders and a few other places, but as a simple matter of the size of our country and a matter of physics, detection physics, it's not really the most efficient approach. So we're shifting to a more agile approach where we arm federal authorities, not just the large numbers of people at the CBP, but also at TSA, other federal agencies, the Coast Guard with detectors, as well as state and local, so that we can surge capabilities when there's intelligence information and thwart any effort. So we're trying to build an architecture that reflects that change in thinking.
Megan, what kinds of innovations do you think we could look towards that would potentially also offer us more in the way of deterrence or in new ways of combating the threat that we haven't thought about?
Well, first, I would say I think it's important to talk about what the it is when we're discussing nuclear terrorism, because we could be talking about terrorists, buying, stealing, or building a nuclear weapon, or we could be talking about a dirty bomb, or we could be talking about blowing up a nuclear facility, a civilian nuclear facility. And I think it's important to think about the spread of the threats, to target where we think we're most vulnerable and what we can do about it. And, I actually have a Wayne Gretzky quote of all things that I think is sort of relevant here, which is, in philanthropy, at the Hewlett Foundation, we talk about strategic philanthropy quite a bit. And I use this quote often. And Gretzky said, someone asked him, why are you so good at this? Why are you great? And he said, a good hockey player plays to where the puck is, and a great hockey player plays to where the puck is going to be. And I think, in particular, when we're talking about nuclear terrorism and the idea, in particular, of the nuclear fuel cycle, that's really what we need to be doing, is looking 20, 30, 50 years down the line to see where the innovations are happening, see where the changes are coming, because there are a lot of changes. And one of the areas on which we work that I think is particularly important is the back end of the fuel cycle, so nuclear waste, which does not sound like a very exciting thing, I'll give you, but actually is becoming increasingly important. And we saw, with regard to Fukushima, that the spent fuel ponds were a major problem. And if anything, that made it clear that they're quite vulnerable. And Bob has already mentioned the Blue Ribbon Commission and its draft subcommittee reports, which I was very happy to see. One, advocate for dry cask storage, which we know is safer than pool storage, and deep geologic storage, which we know is even more safe. The other thing is working on the idea of bringing a multilateral or a regional fuel center out of theory and into the realm of fact. And that's something that we have grantee organizations working on, and that I think is going to be particularly important, especially, Steve Hadley was talking about Asia. Asia has a booming reactor business. It's also a huge consumer now of civilian nuclear energy. And so when you're talking about a dual-use technology, you have to be aware of how the fuel cycle is going to play out down the line. So especially in Northeast Asia, I think the idea of a multilateral fuel facility, instead of having spent fuel in ponds or other unsecure locations scattered all around, and having it in one centralized facility that has IAEA inspection capability, would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the threats then for a second. We have on the record here Russia, we have Pakistan, we have terrorism, and writ large, what are the new possibilities? How does Al-Qaeda view nuclear terrorism? They've certainly written about it extensively, but what's our assessment about how realistic the chances are right now, whether that's changed in some way over the last few years? What do you think, Jim?
Let's talk about that again,
Yeah.
just so we're all on the same playing field here. So we have the threat about attacks on our nuclear power facilities. That's a real threat. Our nuclear facilities are not secure against a realistic terrorist threat. We have the threat of a dirty bomb, which is a little amount of radioactive cesium, for example, put in a conventional explosive and spread across tens of square blocks. A real problem. But the real catastrophic threat is the nuclear explosion itself. And the good news here is that a terrorist group, no matter how sophisticated, cannot build a bomb from scratch. This should be Hillary Clinton's next book. It takes a nation to build a nuclear bomb. You have to have an enormous facility that's billions of dollars, gigawatts of energies, fairly high profile, fairly observable, to make the stuff, to make the highly enriched uranium or the plutonium that's the core of the weapon. If they can get that, however, if they can get it from somebody who's already made it, Russia, Pakistan, or has it in a research reactor like Vietnam or Ghana, if they can get that material, then every step after that is easier for the terrorists to do and harder for us to stop. Fabricating the bomb, smuggling it into the United States, setting it off. So the trick is to stop them from doing that. We're not talking about much stuff. We're talking about 50 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. This is the densest natural material on Earth, heavier than lead, so it could fit in this water pitcher. So you're trying to stop them from getting this. It turns out we know how to do this. We know how to make the facilities where this stuff exists much more secure, much harder to do it. We have federal programs that have been going since 1991 to do it. Some of the stuff, we have interdiction programs to do it. You got to concentrate on securing and eliminating the stockpiles of this material around the world. This is what Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar started. in the Senate. This is the kind of work that Republicans and Democratic administrations are going. This is why the President of the United States called the Nuclear Security Summit last April, why we're having another one in Seoul in 2012. It's to get the international cooperation you need, all those little countries that have enough material for a bomb, all those big countries that have enough material for dozens of bombs, to agree to secure their material before a terrorist can get it.
Just to add to what Joe had to say, again, we have to make sure we know what the objective is. And the objective isn't just to prevent countries from obtaining this nuclear material. It's to have a layered approach so that it's so difficult that they don't try. And the physical protection that Joe is talking about, or the minimization of the use of certain materials, are two of the key elements, but not the only element of a nuclear counterterrorism program. We have to make sure each element along the way is strong and robust and so clearly impossible to overcome that it doesn't happen. No one tries.
And can I also say, I think that, policymakers in the United States and a few other developed nuclear countries agree that nuclear terrorism is a top priority and a top threat. If you ask a huge percentage of the rising powers, they're not going to agree with you that it's a top threat. And I think that's a major problem. And so in the past, the United States, for various reasons, has been able to essentially decree that countries could not acquire uranium enrichment, that they could not acquire various technologies that would allow them to create a bomb. That's no longer the case. And I think that the security community has been somewhat slow to accept that reality and move forward. And I just think that it's important that as a community, when we reach out to the countries who we need to have on board, when we are talking about fissile material security, export controls, a lot of other things, that we realize that there's going to be some give and take here, that we're going to have to engage in a relatively long-term conversation. It's no longer going to be the case that the United States decides unilaterally that we would like XYZ to happen with regard to, nuclear terrorism, nuclear security, and that it will magically be so. That's just no longer the case.
I think this is an important point about what's the convergence between state actors here that we have to deal with in having a policy.
I would, as we think about this, I would encourage people to think about a short-term problem and then a longer-term problem. The short-term problem is partly what Warren was talking about. Can we catch folks who would be trying to get access to fissile material, introduce it into the United States as a weapon, et cetera. Short-term problem is making sure the Russians secure there and the Pakistanis and others that have weapons and or fissile material secure it so terrorists can't get it. That's a good short-term set of things to try and do, as well as the forensics, so you can achieve attribution and know who is trying to get you and therefore threaten response beforehand to gain deterrence. Longer term, we get to those fuel cycle issues, and one first advertisement I have is for a concern that goes beyond highly enriched uranium. Now, some eyes will glaze over, but there is the other material, plutonium, and if that's what you need for highly enriched uranium, this is what you need for plutonium. I mean, it's a smaller amount of material. Now, everybody who does any of this is going to immediately be thinking, well, wait a minute, the weapon design to trigger a plutonium device is called an implosion system. That's the round ball you've seen, and much harder to do. And maybe it is true that a terrorist would have a hard time at that, or a harder time at that. My own position is that if we were to focus just on highly enriched uranium and not on the terrorist threat from plutonium, would be making a huge mistake. That's the first point. The second point is, in all fairness, we all ought to understand there is a debate going on right now among people who are of goodwill, all of whom are opposed to nuclear terrorism and nuclear proliferation, and the debate is in this country over our policy on what are the standards for the export of our equipment. There's news just yesterday about discussions with Saudi Arabia over what's called a 123 or a 123 agreement. What are the terms under which we would allow our industry to sell nuclear reactors to Saudi Arabia?
I tweeted about this today. Sorry, go ahead. It's a real problem. It's a real crisis.
You tweeted about it today.
Yeah.
All right. So we have been engaging in these discussions with other countries, United Arab Emirates, with Vietnam. We've got more discussions going on with the South Koreans and a redo of their agreement. And the issue for Americans, this is an American policy issue. Do we want to have very demanding standards that says if you want to buy an American reactor, you can't go and build your own uranium enrichment plant that could produce highly enriched uranium. You can't reprocess spent fuel, which will separate plutonium from the spent fuel. You must use fuel cycle services from elsewhere or not do it at all. There's a market out there. You don't have to do it. We, as a matter of policy, are not going to export our nuclear technology to countries that will not agree to those terms. Before you say that sounds good, obviously the nuclear industry has folks who believe, and those who just believe in the exports of the United States being important to our economy will argue, wait a minute, the French will sell them without those conditions, the Germans will, the Russians will, the Japanese, well, keep going. So we will, in a sense, exclude ourselves from the market if we take this rigorous position. The counter comes back that we should work harder at getting this as a standard. So I would say that over the long term, that kind of debate, that kind of argument, how many places on the planet are there going to be facilities that will indigenously, under sovereign control, be capable of producing fissile material? And if we let that go, maybe not in 5 years, but in 10 and 15, the world is going to be a much more difficult place for Warren and his colleagues in the U.S. government to police.
Did Japan change our thinking about this in any way? Do you think that affects the debate?
Interestingly, I think probably the folks who are engaged in this debate in the United States are so dug in that virtually no bit of evidence would change their view. I think it has changed the Japanese view. The Japanese were very, very committed to what's called thermal reactor, the current generation of reactors, thermal recycle, and the development of breeders, which means really using plutonium fuels. The Japanese are clearly rethinking that, but I don't know that the Japanese experience has had that kind of impact on the debate in the United States, but I defer to my colleagues.
But it has impacted the international market and the willingness of countries to invest heavily in more nuclear power. So you've seen Japan freeze its plans to increase its nuclear reactor field. Germany has ended its plan to build 14 new reactors. So is Switzerland. Experts say that the nuclear renaissance in the United States is dead. It's over. You might see 2 or 4 more reactors that are already in train coming, but it's not going to be the whole-scale replacement that people envisioned just a year ago. And and it's all because of cost. It's not because of policy issues. It's because the cost of nuclear power has now gone up because of the increased concerns about safety and construction standards. So that actually helps us on this area, because with less demand for nuclear power, there's less demand for new facilities to build nuclear fuel.
Do you see that happen?
Just on this issue of the fuel cycle, which again, in the area of nuclear security, you have to look at it as one element of a defense in-depth approach. I think it's important to separate the use of nuclear power in reactors and enrichment and reprocessing, and a little bit contrary to what Joe said. I mean, the use of nuclear power could expand, but the use of reprocessing could contract, or vice versa. So the two don't necessarily go together. Right. We have to keep our eyes on the prize, if you will, and focus on the things that matter. For
example, we don't take a position on nuclear power. At Ploughshares Foundation, we're completely neutral. We're just saying if you're going to have nuclear power, if this is a part of stopping climate change, make sure in your effort to reduce one global threat, you don't exacerbate the other global threat. Exactly. Have the kind of fuel cycle reforms that my colleagues are talking about.
Also, I think it's interesting that there has been a difference in the way that countries have reacted to Fukushima. Scott Sagan at Stanford has done some interesting analysis about the differential impact of the type of government on the reaction. So democracies tend to have had a much larger reaction, as you might imagine, because publics are concerned about safety. Yeah. That feeds up to policymakers, and policymakers in Germany, for example, shut down their programs. Whereas if you look at China is reviewing, their extremely ambitious, most ambitious worldwide program to build reactors, but they're not really stopping anything. It might be a slowdown briefly, but nothing really is going to change. If you look at Vietnam, they haven't really changed their decision to try and acquire a reactor. And if you look at there's just been a difference around the world, and I just don't think that looking at Germany's reaction that we should think that that is emblematic of the post-Fukushima situation. I think it's a little bit too early to tell.
Yeah, I have to actually agree. I think the impact, just like Chernobyl, will reveal itself over time. I am actually surprised at how little so far it has impacted things and how many countries are proceeding along. I think there were a lot of countries a few years ago, a large number, who thought that they were going to embark on new nuclear power programs, and kind of the weakest among them, I think, have finally realized that you have to take these issues very seriously. But I think at its core, I haven't seen a really big impact yet. It may change.
Did it affect our thinking about the possibilities of a terrorist attack? I mean, there was certainly lots of chatter, and is this pointing out some vulnerabilities we didn't realize, not only just in the overall security of a nuclear plant, but in terms of, terrorists watch the news too, right? And what do we think actually right now about the level of difficulty required? What about the possibilities of nuclear terrorism in the post-Osama bin Laden al-Qaeda?
I would start by saying that we did this a little bit of definition discussion before, and I am also focused on, if you will, the true nuclear yield, the nuclear weapon. I think that that's a certain kind of threat, and its magnitude is quite different than a radiation dispersal device or even an attack on a nuclear site. Having said that, though, I don't think anybody who's been thinking about this, or the four of us, wasn't struck by having everybody on the planet understand that while there's a containment, and sometimes a double containment, triple containment of sorts, around the core of a reactor, that a spent fuel storage pond just kind of sits out there. And it does at an enormous number of our reactors in the United States. The ponds are there, and they have an incredible inventory, increased by putting boron in so you can pack more spent fuel in, because we don't have Yucca Mountain to ship it off to. So I think all of us looked at that and said, well, now anybody who didn't know that the best target might not necessarily be a hardened reactor core, the best target for a bad guy might be the pond, they now know it. So that's not too good. And the Blue Ribbon Commission's conclusion, as was noted, that maybe a better thing to do after the material cools for a bit is to put it in cement holding blocks that are pretty passive and leave it there for 100 years or so until we get a better idea. That's an interim solution which has a lot of benefits, and one of them is precisely to your point, that if you want to secure the spent fuel inventory from terrorists, that's a better way to go than an open pond.
If I could just bring this back to the point that both Bob and Joe made, which is very important about reprocessing, which again separates the plutonium from the rest of the fuel. There's a key link between your storage and ultimate disposal pathway and reprocessing. Countries want to reprocess in part because there is no good pathway for spent nuclear fuel. And so, and there has been over the past several decades this view that we either have to reprocess or put it in permanent underground storage. And as we couldn't politically agree on or technically agree on an underground storage facility, a lot of countries look to reprocessing. If the view is shifting to there are other alternatives such as long-term or interim 100-year storage above ground, that helps to lessen the pressure on reprocessing. So the key message is that there's a link between what we do in our civil fuel cycle and the terrorist risk in terms of acquiring nuclear materials.
Let me add a point to this, moving away from fuel back to the effort to secure nuclear materials everywhere in the world. So to do that, you need the cooperation of dozens of countries to do this. And as George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry have pointed out, in order to get that cooperation, you've got to convince them that we're all part of the same agenda, that this is not an effort to stop them from getting the material and technology, but it's something, and preserve it for ourselves, what some of our colleagues have called nuclear apartheid, but that we're all doing this together. So that brings into question the U.S. and Russian nuclear stockpiles. You've got to show that we are reducing our nuclear weapon stockpiles in order to get the cooperation to secure materials to stop proliferation. So the disarmament activities build the cooperation you need to stop other countries from getting this material. The fact of getting other countries to make progress against proliferation builds the security that you need to continue disarmament. It's two sides of the same coin. You keep flipping it and flipping it. In the United States, you've seen over the last couple of years, under President Bush and Obama, a willingness to draw down our arsenal. We have about 5,000 weapons in the active stockpile. So 5,000 hydrogen bombs, that we could use against targets. Why do we have that many weapons? Part of what you heard in the previous panel was about right-sizing the defense, but reorienting our budget. There's a consensus that we can go way down on those numbers. And the debate is somewhere, do we go to 1,000, do we go to a few hundred? But you can go way down. That policy debate has been paralyzed in the United States, like all other policy debates, because of the fierce partisan nature of the political system at this point. So President Obama's opponents will criticize his efforts to negotiate with Russia because they'll say it's weak, it's appeasement, it's giving away our national security. Here's what's really interesting. That policy debate is in some ways being superseded by the budget realities. By the budget realities. Where are you going to put your money? What are you going to spend your money on? Last week, Senator Coburn, one of the most conservative senators in the United States, introduced a plan to cut $4 trillion off the national budgets over the next 10 years, including over $1 trillion from defense, including a big chunk out of the nuclear budget. And he proposed a plan that could have come out of the Arms Control Association that says we're going to cut our nuclear missiles by 1/3. We're going to delay construction of a new nuclear bomber. We're going to reduce the number of nuclear subs. Why? Money. Money. You don't need to spend that kind of money on those weapons. We don't need to anymore. And we're going to preserve that resources for the real security threats we face. So you see this very interesting confluence now of budget realities with the policy realities syncing up in a way that nobody would have thought possible even a year ago.
Can you just jump in?
concur.
Everybody agrees with Joe.
There's one proviso here. The Gang of Four, as they are known, who were very, I think, clear about the importance of, over the long term, the United States moving towards zero in terms of its nuclear weapons, I think captured a fundamental truth that Joe was pointing to. It's very hard for us to continue to argue to the rest of the world what's in everybody's best interest if we don't follow the same advice. Now, that, I think, as a political posture, that's correct. And I think also as a political posture, we are sort of doing that by the reductions and the negotiations we've had with the Russians. For me, personally, I think we could do a lot more. And over time, I'm hoping we will do a lot more. And I'm sure if we do, it'll attract the necessary political consensus, partly because of what Joe said, because for financial reasons we'll want to do that, and because the other threats will look much more serious to us, and we'll have to put our defense dollars against them. Having said all that, the enemy here, if we were talking, if the core of our discussion, at least so far, is on nuclear terrorism, these bad guys are not going to be impressed by arms control and disarmament, right? I mean, so, and I wouldn't want you to think we think they would be. That's not, I think, how we look at terrorists and their calculations. This is a matter of how governments behave and how we want governments to behave with respect to their fissile material. But we have to understand that that terrorist threat is going to exist independent of this kind of policy action.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. How do we view global zero? It's a interesting political issue in the sense that President Obama has put it out there as something we're moving towards. At the same time, we seem to be talking about proliferating threats. So there seems to be a real, almost a two-track conversation in a way. Is it, just a sort of utopian thing we're shooting for in a political sense? It has these diplomatic ramifications, but I don't know, Joe. Is it just to challenge you here? You've made the good case for it. Is it utopianism, though? Is it a useful framework for thinking about this issue, given all the threats that we're talking about in this discussion?
I don't think it's utopian at all, and I don't think the presidents of the United States have thought it was utopian. Every single president, almost every single president, has embraced this goal since Harry Truman, but people have recognized the difficulty of achieving it, particularly during the Cold War period. The Cold War is over, but the Cold War weapons remain. There's an increasing realization that we can reduce it. Can you get to zero? Can you actually eliminate every single nuclear weapon? I would say nobody actually knows the answer to that. So I wouldn't characterize it as utopian or realistic. We just don't know. But what we do know is that we can make great progress in a step-by-step path, getting lower and lower in a way that doesn't harm our national security interests at all, and that in fact preserves our resources to devote to the real national security threats. And when you get down to, say, 200, 300 weapons, which a lot of people think is about, what do we need more than 300 hydrogen bombs to protect the United States? Wouldn't that pretty much do it? If you get down to that level, then you have you've built enough mechanisms in place that you can take a realistic assessment. Can we build a verification system that can ensure that we can get rid of the last weapon and still feel secure and not be subject to nuclear blackmail by Canada, who suddenly announces they built a nuclear bomb and want to renegotiate the St. Lawrence Seaway Agreement? That's that bomb in the basement problem. You don't know the answer to that yet, but you go. And having that goal makes the rest of our work so much easier. Knowing that we're moving in that direction, reducing the number of nuclear weapons, not only builds up the security cooperation you need, but reduces the targets that terrorists could go after. It reduces the number of nuclear weapons in the world and convinces people not to be building up their arsenals like India and Pakistan are doing.
Well, right. But in fact, we're going in the wrong direction.
We are.
Look at South Asia, Pakistan, right, in the midst of all the other ongoing stories, has been adding significantly to its nuclear arsenal. Is that right?
I think I always like to start by saying I agree with Joe. I agree with Joe that it is very useful to have this target. It is politically useful for us to have the target of global nuclear zero. I, though, also think that we here want to be credible with an American audience and an international audience. We recognize how hard that will be to get to zero. And secondly, though, that we think that there are some great advantages to reducing the number of weapons, not only politically, but also technically. If I were going to list threats I particularly worry about that come under the nuclear rubric, I would myself would start with nuclear terrorism, a true nuclear attack by a terrorist group with a weapon either that was stolen and modified for their use or a improvised nuclear device detonated in an American city. Number one threat. And then I have other things. I'm worried about the transfer of a nuclear weapon and nuclear material from a place like North Korea. I mean, people say, well, that's not going to happen. I mean, why would they do that? Well, they built a plutonium production reactor in Syria. Mm-hmm. Get it? Right? And then there's Iran. Why would Iran transfer? Well, Iran is a source, we think, of a more conventional weaponry to terrorists than any other country on the planet. When they have fissile material, I will begin to worry, even if they don't build a nuclear weapon. I'll be worried as soon as they have fissile material. So these things I worry about a lot. They're not necessarily particularly sensitive as threats to what we do in this strategic area with the Russians. Then, when we do something with the Russians and we come down to lower levels, we can say, well, there's another problem. What about the accidental or unintended launch of a nuclear weapon by a current nuclear weapon state? Oh, pick Russia or China. Well, that's bad too. Let's have less numbers, better secured, different kind of alert status. I think all that would be neat. Lower numbers, politically useful, but also technically useful. At some point, there are other nuclear weapon states on the planet that will have to become involved in this discussion we have been having, these negotiations with the Russians. And you have a separate relationship between India and Pakistan that isn't necessarily sensitive to this either. And you were, I think, prompting me to say something about the Pakistani nuclear program. It's quite extraordinary. And unless you're in this business, I am willing to bet you don't have a clue about how extraordinary the Pakistani nuclear weapons program is. It is large, it is varied, it's based on plutonium and highly enriched uranium, it's varied in a lot of different ways, and it's going up, not down. And the Indians are responding to that, and the Indians are also looking at the Chinese. So all these things create a textured threat that we in the United States need to be thinking about. And when we think about the global zero, have to recognize that some of them will be sensitive to what we do there, and some of these threats just simply won't be.
In addition, I would add that in having our talks with the Russians in order to get our arsenal numbers down and their arsenal numbers down, and it's bringing up a lot of issues, strategic security issues that I think we're going to have to grapple with at some point anyway. And I think that it's, whether or not you believe that we will ever get to zero, it's incredibly useful to have these discussions with other countries. For example, in our discussions with Russia about how to reduce our numbers and what that might look like, we have to start talking about NATO, and we've had to start talking with them about a nuclear NATO and what that looks like, and if it should continue. We've had to start talking, to a certain degree about China, and we've had to start talking about our alliances in Asia, our security alliances with Asia, and how those impact, maritime issues in the South China Sea, China's drive to build new weapons, which in turn affects India and Pakistan, et cetera. And so I think that it's a really tough, ball of yarn, if you will, series of problems that we're having to untangle, but we are having to untangle them to even consider having discussions about going lower. And I think that it's difficult, but it's useful, and it's going to have to happen.
It's good to have goals out there, even if they're aspirational. It's good for us, and it's good for our diplomacy with other countries, as Joe said. Bob and I, a long time ago, had the opportunity to work with another guy named Bob Rocklin, who was one of the negotiators of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, under which, as you may know, 150 or so of its non-nuclear weapon state parties give up their right to acquire nuclear weapons. And I recall in long conversations with him how difficult and how little most of the State Department believed that we would ever have a non-proliferation treaty. So things that seem implausible now may not always seem implausible.
Well, I know we want to get to your audience questions, but I did promise the group that we were going to go around and have a lightning round so that we can all have something to tweet about that's short enough. But this is a field that is really given to misconceptions, and I think that's one of the things that we talked about was, what are the biggest misconceptions that are out there when it comes to nuclear security or nuclear terrorism? I'm going to put you on the spot first, Warren.
Okay. So we were actually given the heads up, just to be honest about this, but
Forgot about that.
Yes,
You were the inspiration.
Okay, stall.
Long answer.
I'll speak slowly, which I often don't do. I think the biggest misconception, both inside and outside government, is that this is complicated. We have hundreds of different government programs to address nuclear security with hundreds of different names and acronyms. But when you break nuclear security down to its component parts, and you look at it sort of in the way Bob was going down with the pathways, where the material comes from, and the basic elements of physical protection, materials accountancy, intelligence, forensics, detection, it's really not as complicated as I think Washington bureaucrats make it sound by the myriad of programs we have. So I think the things that I think some people are misled on is that they can't have an informed opinion on a lot of these issues, and in fact, I think they can.
I would say I think the biggest misconception is that we have to follow the guidelines set out during the Cold War in terms of thinking about addressing these problems, whether that's our targeting, our force structure, the number of weapons we have, who we view as allies or not. And I don't think that is the case any longer?
The two biggest misconceptions are, one, that nuclear terrorism is easy. It is not. It is really hard to do this, and it's one of the reasons it hasn't happened yet. And the other is that there's nothing we can do to stop it. That's not true. This is the ultimate preventable catastrophe. This is the most serious national security threat to the United States, and we can make it almost impossible for any group to do this if we devote the resources and presidential attention to the programs that can stop nuclear terrorism.
So if the greatest misconception Joe thinks is that this is easy, I will say that the greatest misconception is that it's hard. And by that I mean that it's too hard. I don't believe it's too hard. I think that's the debatable point. And because I don't believe it's too hard, I find the confidence that people in the nuclear industry have that even if we have large-scale flows of fissile material around the world, we are good enough, smart enough, capable enough to secure that material against terrorists, and I don't think we are.
On that cheery note, I'm sure there's lots of questions out there in the audience. Please just jump up. Do we have microphones? Right there in the back. Sure.
Yeah, my name's Greg Amadon. I'm from Seattle. Ever since I read John McPhee's book, The Curve of Binding Energy, which he points out that plutonium can be completely shielded from radiation detectors by a couple layers of aluminum foil, I've been very, very concerned that if a terrorist acquired plutonium or a plutonium bomb, suitcase bomb, it would be virtually undetectable by radiation detectors. I have a two-part question. First, was John McPhee right that you can wrap plutonium in aluminum foil and make it invisible to the best radiation detectors? And second, if true, doesn't it virtually guarantee that a plutonium device would be a terrorist organization's nuclear device of choice due to its undetectability?
Okay, so I mean, first, the basic concept is right. Nuclear detection is hard. Some types of radiation don't go very far, and it's one of the reasons we're reassessing our strategy related to detection and response. The specific physical fact you mentioned is not right. It's not. Plutonium is made of several isotopes which give off both gamma and neutrons, which are, in the scale of detectability, easier to detect. So the physical point is not right.
Could we ask Warren if he were going to have to worry about a uranium-based bomb detection or a plutonium-based bomb? Which would you rather worry about?
I'd rather worry about plutonium.
Let me just have a comment. I want to congratulate Warren for a very tough decision he took earlier this week. If I'm right about this. Warren canceled $1 billion program. Now, this is really hard to do in Washington. Really hard to do. And he canceled something called the Advanced Spectroscopic Portal Monitoring System that just didn't work. These things the price was getting out of control. We were going up to $1 million per monitor for this, and it just didn't work. It was an effort to do what the gentleman's talking about, to find a monitor that would intrusively sort of target trucks and containers and query them and see if there was fissile material in it. This is an extremely demanding task. Is it possible? Yes, but boy, is it expensive, as Warren discovered.
What a great point. Okay, here, and then someone in the front.
Thank you very much. Massimo Calabresi from Time Magazine. My question is about deterrence, which has come up obliquely in a couple of the conversations. My understanding, back when I paid more attention to these issues, was that one of the greatest problems with transnational terrorists acquiring a nuclear device was that deterrence was very, very difficult. So I'd like to ask the simple question, how is deterrence of transnational terrorism, terrorist use of nuclear devices possible? Presumably there's some technical matters, detection of the source of the nuclear material, but in a broader sense, the question of how you respond to a state that is the source of that material, it seems to me, is much more complicated than our old mutually assured destruction, understanding of how deterrence might work. Is a treaty required? And then just the last point to add on that gets into some of the discussion of reductions. Is it conceivable, if you got the kind of international framework for deterrence that presumably would be necessary, that model of deterrence might then begin to supplant the old and what you have suggested is no longer applicable deterrent framework that we have?
I'll start on that. First, for people who don't think about deterrence all the time, we've been living with deterrence ever since we couldn't figure out how to stop a ballistic missile. And one could argue that we're still principally relying on deterrence, that is the promise of retaliation to deal with an intercontinental ballistic missile threat. The problem with the nuclear terrorist threat, there are several when you think about deterring and promising retaliation as a method of discouraging the attack on the United States, is A, you might not know who did it. I mean, there might be a detonation tomorrow morning, as I said, and someone may take credit, but you might not know who did it. And the second thing is, even if you knew who did it, they might not live someplace so that you could retaliate against them, or they might just not be open to retaliation or care about it. I mean, one proposition is that anybody who values your death more than their life is not a really good candidate for deterrence. So there are certain problems with extending the deterrent mindset to the nuclear terrorism. However, as I argued before, since defense is so hard, and I'm not going to say impossible, Warren is sitting on my right, so I'm not going to say that, but it's really hard to count on defending the United States and our long borders, land and sea, against the introduction of a weapon. We think deterrence. Deterrence, then, requires that we be persuasive that if you are involved in an attack on the United States, we will figure out it is you and we will come and get you for it. So you start backing that up and say, okay, well, if you catch the weapon before it detonates, or as they say in the business, pre-det, then you have a whole weapon to look at, and you can look at the way it's designed and built and try to figure out where it came from. You can look at the material. The forensic work is hard, but easier than the ugly situation of post-det, where the people who sweep in from those laboratories Warren knows so much about, and they don't help anybody who's still alive. They are going around scooping up dirt and other kinds of things to do the attribution task, to try to attribute the material and the weapon to a chain, hopefully getting back to where the fissile material came from. That's hard work. And I don't really want to say a lot more about that, but except it would be a really good thing were we in a position to say, if anybody does that to us or an ally of ours, we have the capability to figure out pre-det or post-det who was involved, who did it, and we'll get them. That would be a nice thing to be able to say. It might not work for some of the other reasons that make deterrence hard in this scenario, but it would be a better place to be. I don't think we've yet said that. And I don't think it would be appropriate worry to say that just now, but we might be able to at some point. There is, in addition, if you're thinking about what the enemy is like when you think deterrence, what the problem is, there is the case you want to deter North Korea now, right? And you want to deter Iran if it gets nuclear weapons. Got it. All right. Who do you want to deter if it's Al-Qaeda? Well, Al-Qaeda, but you can't, let's say, for the other reasons I mentioned. Well, then you want to, I would argue, persuade those countries that either have nuclear weapons or fissile material that they need to cooperate with us and overall secure that material. We need to persuade them that if they are involved because they have failed to act responsibly, there will be consequences. Well, who am I talking about? Russians, Pakistanis, and others, French, British. What kind of consequences against allies? What kinds of consequences about countries that have nuclear weapons of their own? What kinds of consequences when we don't believe the government is complicit, except to the extent that they've failed to take necessary steps? It seems to me that not exactly deterrence, but there's another concept in there somewhere, maybe one could call it expanded deterrence. We can't call it extended deterrence because it's used for something else. But expanded deterrence, where we want to really compel others with material to understand that if we trace it back to Chelyabinsk or Arzamas in Russia, and we don't think the Russians have done everything to secure their material, they won't get a pass. Well, what does that exactly mean? I have no idea. But if you're thinking about deterrence, I think you have to think about that case as well as the country with the sentient government that is intending to participate in the transfer of material and ultimately a detonation in the United States. That's all I know.
Before, Warren, you get into the technical...
Okay.
Oh, you weren't.
Well, I was just going to say, Bob's right. A lot of people have thought about deterrence, in particular in the 50s and 60s, and everything Bob said is right, as everything Bob says. But he forgot. I mean, there are two different types of deterrence. There's deterrence by retribution, and there's deterrence by denial. And so Bob's talking about deterrence by retribution that is probably only effective, perhaps, against the states that may potentially supply the nuclear material terrorists would use. But deterrence by denial is very important in what we do. Again, the administration's goal is to make nuclear terrorism prohibitively difficult. You want to deter your adversary from even trying by making it so difficult that they know they won't succeed. And so that form of deterrence is an essential element of a counterterrorism strategy.
Excuse me, I call that defense by denial, but that's just terminology.
Did you want to say something, maybe?
It was actually about that.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions, so let's try to get a couple more in here. You've been very patient in the front here, and then we'll go to the back. Here in the front.
I'm Andy Maynard from IBM. Oh, I got to stand up. I hate to take us back to basics, but this is a fascinating discussion. I just want to ask, I tend to believe when there's a public-private partnership engaged in something, has a higher chance to succeed. And I've learned a lot today about organizations that are engaged in this complex arena. But I just want, and I was thinking if we could have a public-private partnership on drone strikes, it'd make a lot of people happy, but that's not going to happen.
Make a lot of people very unhappy.
Yeah, that's probably true. But so can I just, one of you, can you just give us an audit of who, you all were using a lot of pronouns when we talked to the Russians, when this happened. Who is doing this, and who, an audit of the organizations? Is it NGOs? Is it multilateral? Who is leading? Who's accountable? Who's supporting? Just a little bit about who's at the helm here. Be helpful for me.
That's a very hard question.
Well, let me start.
Yeah.
There are about 20,500 nuclear weapons in the world. The U.S. and Russia have about 19,000 of them. So we dwarf everybody else. The other 1,000 weapons or so are divided up among the other countries, including France, United Kingdom, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, down to North Korea, which has somewhere between 2 and 8 nuclear weapons. So talks tend to go on a multilateral basis. So the permanent members of the Security Council are all nuclear powers, no coincidence. They talk among themselves about these things. It goes on an alliance basis. NATO is currently going through an extended review of the NATO strategic posture that includes nuclear. But the big money, the big issues are U.S.-Russia. And we just did the START agreement, passed the Senate last December. The two sides are now engaged in dialogue about negotiations about the next treaty, which is expected to be a much bigger, much deeper cut. This is almost purely a government function. That's who talks about this. That's who makes the deals. That's who control the weapons. The non-government community and the foundations, such as the 3 represented up here, play a role in funding groups to help come up with ideas. Because if you're in Warren's position, you got your hands full just getting through the day. So every once in a while, it's nice to look up and have somebody come and give you a memo or a paper from Harvard or Stanford or the Arms Control Association that says, hey, here's 3 things you could do right away if you thought about this. They also do track 2 discussions. So you get people that are not in government but are kind of connected to the government to talk informally about this. We fund efforts like this with Iranians. with Iranians. We fund Russians with talks like this with the Russians to try to, plow the ground. What kind of stuff might be possible that you can then feed into the government discussions? And finally, there's the media. The media is huge on this. Right now, the media coverage of national security issues is mostly war coverage. They're covering the wars. And there's not that much about budgets, about policies, about strategy, but a single article in Politico, or the Washington Post, or the AP, the New York Times, can move bureaucracies. It's like sending a memo to the president. It gets right to the White House. It gets right to the Kremlin. So the media role in this is often overlooked and underestimated.
There are also quite a few multilateral organizations that play an important role. So the UN via sanctions and other situations, the IAEA, which does all of the international monitoring, et cetera. And then internally within our own government, we have, the State Department leading the effort on the U.S.-Russia, the last round of U.S.-Russia negotiations, and presumably there will be a next round. However, obviously, you've got the White House and DOD and quite a few other parts of the government weighing in on what our own nuclear posture should be, what our discussions with the Russians should look like, what is and is not acceptable to us, et cetera.
Okay, in the back for our last question. David.
Speaking of the media, influential in memos to the president by having them appear front page, column right.
Hi, David.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stern, you mentioned briefly the move to a new strategy, and I'm trying to figure out the degree to which that is related to the cancellation of the portal program that you talked about in Congress earlier in the week. Is it your sense that the existing strategy, which was the hope to put these portals in place and be able to do this kind of advanced detection, is a technology we won't see for 5 years, 10 years? Are the handheld and smaller devices you referred to a real replacement for that, or is it sort of a stopgap? And how would you relate that to the deterrence discussion that you had raised as a different form of deterrence?
Yeah, thank you. No, they're actually separate issues. The ASP decision was based on really three key elements, one of which was a study we had done by the National Academies of Sciences that was critical of our testing. The second was a change in operational requirements. And the third is simply that in the commercial market, and this is the public-private partnership, things have moved forward since 2004 when the ASP program actually began. I mean, there are spectroscopic portals that are available commercially, and so it struck us that, given that the amount of effort we have to put back into retesting the ASP to move it forward in the right way, it didn't make any sense to do so without looking at what the commercial market had to offer. And so this was a time for a course correction. That doesn't take away at all from the fact that we scan, and I think the CBP representative yesterday mentioned, nearly 100% of all containerized cargo now. We are using what are called PVT plastic portals, and then in secondary scanning we use spectroscopic handheld devices, and as part of the ASP decision we are going to move forward and accelerate deployment of actually even more advanced than the ASP, but handheld detectors. So deterrence is important. It's important to close down pathways in a sort of logical, rational way, and I think our ports of entry is are one of the areas where we've actually done an exceptionally good job, notwithstanding the course correction on the ASP system.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is an important, should we try to get one more? I want to squeeze you in right now. One more question.
Thank you very much. This has been an excellent panel. Evelyn Farkas from the U.S. European Command. Bob Gallucci mentioned that the most likely source of material for the terrorists would be Pakistan or Russia. And the United States has been working pretty intensely with Russia and also with Pakistan. My question has to do with China because that was also mentioned in the context of the response to Fukushima. In your assessment, all of you on the panel, what is the likelihood that we might be able to work more closely, perhaps in light of Fukushima, in light also of Chinese concern about terrorism on their territory, more closely with the Chinese with regard to Pakistan?
I'm now going to violate what is usually a good rule, which is when you have absolutely nothing to say, keep your mouth shut. It seems to me unavoidable to observe that the extent to which we could get the Chinese to share some of our objectives with Pakistan. One of the interesting things about U.S.-Pakistani relations is that we have a bunch, and they aren't all in sync in terms of what we want to accomplish, and it is not clear to me that we coordinate all that perfectly well. But I would offer that some of what we might want to accomplish with the Pakistanis, the Chinese would as well. They would not have an interest in certain outcomes that would be harmful to us, and they might well work with us. The extent to which they would turn not only on the coincidence of those objectives, but on how comfortable they are working with us at all, and that turns on U.S.-Chinese relations, which are sometimes good and sometimes less good. And that's why I normally, when I have nothing to say, don't say anything.
Just one closing word on Pakistan. For me, Pakistan is the most dangerous country on earth. This is a far greater nuclear threat than North Korea or Iran. They have enough material for about 100 nuclear weapons. They're producing nuclear material at a faster rate than any country on earth. They've got strong Islamic fundamentalist influences in their military and its intelligence apparatus. They have an unstable government. If my friend Ambassador Haqqani was here, he would assure me that the top troops in the country are dedicated to guarding the crown jewels of Pakistan. I believe that is true. For me, it's not a question of the security of the weapons, it's a question of the stability of the government. Last month or so, a few weeks ago, there was a major insurgent attack on the Karachi Naval Air Station. This is not a trivial military installation. It took 18 hours for the military forces of Pakistan to end that attack. Over 24 people died in that attack. It was clear there was inside information that helped the insurgents in that attack. 15 kilometers from the Karachi Naval Air Station is a nuclear weapons storage facility. There has not been an attack on a nuclear weapons storage facility. I don't know of any information that the insurgents want to attack a nuclear weapons storage facility in Pakistan. But this is not a trivial issue. This is not something that is going to go away anytime soon. We have real urgent threats out there, and this is at the top of my list.
I was actually in China a couple of weeks ago on with a group of very high-level Americans speaking with very high-level Chinese officials and experts about nuclear security. And we did not explicitly discuss Pakistan, but one of the things that I came away with, overall I went in, pessimistic about the U.S.-China strategic relationship writ large, and as Bob said, that is going to impact how we work with China on all kinds of things. On the area of nuclear security specifically, there is one bright spot, which is that during the Obama visit with Chinese officials, I think in January, we decided to jointly open a Center for Excellence on nuclear issues. And that is going to be opening in Beijing. It's modeled largely on Sandia National Laboratories. And so it could be that is a window of opening for us to start on a more technical basis, cooperating a little bit on nuclear issues. There's the legacy of the Cox Report, which ended our lab-to-lab with the Chinese and has left the Chinese very, very wary of starting things up again. But there is the chance that could be an opening. I think specifically with regard to Pakistan, that's a much larger question that's going to hinge on a whole lot of strategic issues. I think it would be fantastic if we were able to work with the Chinese a bit more on Pakistan. But I'll leave that to my State Department colleagues to try and work out for themselves.
Okay, Last word, Warren.
Well, I just follow Bob's advice, although I do it more rigorously when I don't have something useful to say. I don't say anything. So.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for a terrific panel today. I'm glad that we all agree with each other so much. And thank you.
Thank you.
Now, lunch is available in the lobby. Please gather it and bring it inside so we can start the next session.